Hi, everybody. Welcome back. It's Tuesday, another edition of Crafting and Crime Daily, the show where I, Rebecca, recap live trials for you. Currently covering the trial of Scott Peterson for child neglect. 7 counts of child neglect, 3 counts of culpable negligence, and 1 count of perjury. Yes. So this all stems out of the February 14th, 2018 mass shooting by Nicholas Cruz at Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School when he entered building 1,200, shot and killed 17 people, injured 17 others. We will get to that in a minute. We're currently recapping day 4 of the trial, still during the prosecution's case. And boy, are they rehashing everything. Well, not everything, but a lot of stuff. So what else is going on? Well, we're at like T-minus 2 hours and counting until the arraignment of Donald Trump. Yes, former president, regretfully former president. Now this cause of action was filed in federal court in Miami. So he will be appearing in Miami. They've set up they've got the security all set up so nobody can harm Donald Trump. He's expected to be arraigned at 3 p.m. Now, my understanding is he will arrive in an underground parking lot and be taken through the building that way. So nobody's going to see him, But to be a fly on the wall when they take his mugshot and they fingerprint him, oh, he'll probably have his toupee on until he gets convicted. Then, remember Alex Murdaugh, what he looked like? Like the afternoon of his conviction, like after he gets back to the jail, they like shave his head. Can you see Donald Trump sans toupee? Yeah. Anyway, I know I'm having way too much fun with this. Way too much fun. he's a, why am I laughing? Oh my God. I'm sorry. He's in trouble for keeping classified documents in his home at Mar-a-Lago, which is also a club. So he would have guests over to this place all the time. Lots and lots of visitors come to Mar-a-Lago. I did not know this. I never got an invitation. So there were documents in the bathrooms, in the bedrooms, in the ballrooms. There was just documents everywhere. Like, come on. Oh, you have to go to the bathroom? Reading material. It's in there for you. It's classified, but who cares? It's good reading. Yeah. Anyway, I digress. So clearly he's going to appear at 3 o'clock and say, not guilty, not guilty. How dare you bring these false charges against me? This is a witch hunt. I'm sorry. But I had to tell the other side, right? Okay, let's stop talking about it because it's just way too funny. Okay, what else is going on? So yesterday there was a bail hearing in the Corey Richards case. So I did cover this when she was initially arrested. She's been sitting in jail with no bond, and so this was the defense asking for a bond hearing. So in this hearing, she is charged with aggravated murder of her husband, Eric Richards. This is the guy that the woman she bought the fentanyl and laced his Moscow mule that night. And then after he was dead, she writes a children's book for her kids about how to grieve the loss of their father. Anyway, and she does quite well with that for the next year. And then they figure out, hey, fentanyl. And then actually what happens is a confidential informant came forward to talk about how they were supplying the fentanyl to Corey Richards. And there's a question about whether, when she calls 911 at 3:22 in the morning and they arrive on scene shortly thereafter, he's dead. She says he's an unresponsive male on the phone. That's how the call went out, as an unresponsive male. She said she administered vigorous CPR, but there was no evidence that anyone performed CPR on this man. So the judge, there were several prosecution witnesses, several defense witnesses. This was like a whole hearing. Because what the judge says is, as this, you know, before the state files their intention to seek the death penalty, it's his job to determine if there's enough evidence that a jury could reasonably come to the conclusion beyond a reasonable doubt that she committed aggravated murder. And he said, there is. There's plenty of evidence. And he went through all the evidence. He says the circumstances in this case weigh heavily against granting her bail. Some of the reasons he gave that this might lead to some desperate measures like harming herself, harming her children, harming other people, harming witnesses. And he also felt it was a motivation for her to flee, and that she was not a good candidate for supervision. And one of the reasons he gave was anyone that could commit, be in the mindset to commit this atrocity in a desperate situation could be expected to do anything. You just don't know what. They're almost impossible to supervise. So he thought that she was a substantial danger to the community and that she remain in custody until the completion of her case. So she was not granted any bail. So she will remain there until the next hearing, which will probably be her arraignment. She has not been arraigned yet. She has not entered a plea. Obviously, I think she's going to say not guilty, but I don't know. All right, so let's talk about the trial of Scott Peterson. So it continued. I can't talk today. What language is that? Continued. I don't know. Okay, so there was several sheriff's deputies. Well, let's see, BSO. There was one from BSO. One from Coral Springs. A couple of teachers. Yeah. So the cops. This was really interesting information. But some behind the scenes information going on was one of the jurors had sent an email to the judge either late last week or earlier maybe in the week. And she said, my employer has said that they'll pay me for up to 10 days of jury duty. And then after that, I have to use my own PTO. So he said that he would call her. He told the court, I'm going to call her employer and we're going to have a talk about the jury system in this country and how they should respect the jury process. And then if they're not amenable to paying her while she is on jury duty, then I'll just have to release the name of the company. So in public, I'm like, oh. So he updated that yesterday. He came on and he said that I have talked to human resources, and he says, let me just tell you that this company last year had a profit of $7.8 billion. They can afford to pay this woman for jury duty. And I have asked that the company owner call me. So, yeah. And if they're not going to cooperate, I'm going to release the name of the company. I'm like, whoa. Okay, he's pretty serious. So I'd love to know what company it is. There's a lot of companies in that, in South Florida. So I have no idea. But one that took in quite a bit of money, $7.8 billion. Billion dollars. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. So back to the trial. So first we have Richard Andreas. He heard about. He's a Broward sheriff's officer. He heard about the shooting over the radio. He knew that he was going to the the 1200 building. He was familiar with the school, so he parked on the east side. He saw that he testified that he had seen 2 dead teenagers on the floor. He assisted with pulling out victims. He heard kids screaming. He said it was hard to describe everything that he heard. And then they showed his body cam footage of what was going on when he got there. Now, he arrived after the fact. It was part of the rescue effort. And really, it was to tell the story of what he saw on the 3rd floor. So then we had Tim Burton, who was a is a Coral Springs school resource officer. He knows and is friends with Scott Peterson. And you could tell this testimony was really difficult for him because you don't want to throw your friend under the bus. You don't want to do that. And he was trying very hard not to come across like he was doing that. He arrives on the scene. The school that he works at was not far from Marjorie Stoneman Douglas. So he gets in his car when he hears about this, and on the way he has certain information. And some of the information that he got was that the shooter was in the 3-story building, and then they told him where that was strategically located streetwise, and that the shooter was last seen in the 3-story building and the northeast parking lot. So he arrives thinking, okay, so he parks in the northeast parking lot. Then he runs over to where Scott Peterson is, but not really. Like, Scott is in front of the 700 building. This guy's still in the parking lot. But he hollers out to Scott, hey, buddy, what's going on? What do we got? And where's the shooter? And he said, now, at this point, he said he didn't run into the building because he was not hearing any shooting, and he knew that there were already 2 SWAT teams in that building. So Scott tells him that he hadn't heard any shots in the last few minutes and that he wasn't sure where the shooter was, but he said, I don't know the exact location of the shooter, but you might want to watch your back. He could be behind you in that parking lot. So at this point, this guy is hunkered down between a tree and an SUV. And it was made very, very clear through the cross-examination. So you didn't rush into the building? No, I did not. The information I got was he was either still in that building or he was in the parking lot. So I was looking out. He was actually had his back turned to the 1200 building and was looking toward the parking lot. They did get information that over the Coral Springs radio that they were looking for a white male with a burgundy ROTC shirt, and that information came from the campus monitor. So what happens was he runs into the campus monitor, and the campus monitor tells him that. He did not know. He just assumed that Scott Peterson had this information. So it was his thinking at this point. He says, I thought that we had this shooter trapped in the parking lot somewhere. Later on, he helped take the kids out of the building. It was their goal to try to get most of the wounded and the deceased out of the building before they could get the kids out, because they didn't really want the kids to see that. So he was helping them load up the deceased onto these golf carts and driving them to another location. Here's an interesting thing, though. On cross-examination, it came out that at his high school, where he is a school resource officer, there are 3,000 students, and there are 2 school resource officers. At the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas, there are 3,300 students and one school resource officer and cover 45 acres of campus. I thought that was really interesting. So he said that part of their training is you get to the last reference point and then you take cover. So the last reference point for Scott Peterson would have been the last thing he heard was that it was either the 12 or 1,300 buildings, somewhere maybe even in between those two buildings. He didn't know if it was in or out of those two buildings, but it was somewhere. So his reference point was by the 700 building, which I talked about yesterday. It was 20 yards. It's just a little strip of grass that separates the 1,200 and the 700 building, just this little strip of grass. So he took cover by the cement pole that was there. And that's consistent with his training, that to, run till you get to your last reference point, and then you take cover until if the shooting continues and you could determine more, then you would continue to run towards that shooting. Now he was asked about his ability to function basically with two radios, because these school resource officers, student resource officers, they have the city radio, their police radio, and there's always traffic on that, and then they have their school radio where the teachers and principals can talk. And he said it's very difficult to concentrate on a task when you've got both these radios going, and especially in this high stress situation. I mean, the radios were just bzz, 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 and he said it would definitely divide your attention, that you've got these two radios and you're trying to ascertain where these gunshots are coming from. So, and he talked about how adrenaline causes what he said was auditory exclusion. And he said, I suffered it that day. Two things that the adrenaline caused in him: auditory exclusion and tunnel vision. So he described the tunnel vision like you're just so focused on one thing, like in the periphery, it's all blurred. Like you're just so focused. And with respect to the auditory exclusions, he said you'll hear some things very distinctly, and then you'll miss other things totally. You just won't even hear other things. And that happens to me a lot when my sister's talking to me. I'm sorry. I'm just joking. But I understand what he's saying. Like, it used to happen to me at work when people would come up to me and talk to me about, my daughter was in the ballet, and I'm trying to focus on my job. And so I'm like auditory, like I'm hearing, it's like wah, 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 because I'm trying to, you get it, right? Okay. So, and here's an interesting, and I had to write this down. He said, we are human beings. I can't read my own writing. Human emotions, I did not write emotions down. I don't know what that was I wrote. Human emotions take over despite the best of training. Despite the best training, you could still have auditory exclusion. You could still have tunnel vision. These things happen. So then, on cross-examination, I thought that was really good by the defense attorney. He's so good. There's a lot of times that he could be objecting to what the prosecution is, the types of questionings they're leading. They're doing all this, treating their officers as experts, stuff that is objectionable. And this defense attorney is just not objecting. And I think he's doing it strategically. I think he wants to endear himself to the jury. He wants the jury to like him. He wants the jury to like his client. He doesn't want to get up there and seem like he's the bad guy, And I get that. So he's very respectful of the court, although a lot of times he'll ignore the judge's ruling and he'll just keep on with what he's doing. And that's that auditory exclusion thing. To be honest with you, that's what it is. He is so focused on the questions that he is asking. He hears the judge, but it's not clicking in his brain. Oh, I got to change that question. So he asked this line of questioning about child neglect. Now, he didn't use the word child neglect. He said, is it your job as a school resource officer to make sure that all those children are nourished? Is it, no, I'm a police officer. Yes, is it your job to make sure they're all hydrated? And he's like, no, I'm a police officer. I don't have anything to do with that. And I thought, oh, good point. Yeah. Yeah. So interesting. Then we had a teacher on. Poor thing. She was a teacher up on the third floor. There was no fourth floor. She was a teacher up on the third floor. She had the room right next door to Scott Beagle. Scott Beagle was a teacher that was murdered. So she was teaching English and creative writing. She's been at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas for 11 years. And so that was her permanent classroom there. And it was an elective. She was teaching, that's what she was teaching that day, creative writing. And because it's an elective, you can have 30, 40 kids in your class. So it was a very large class. They had the fire drill that morning. And so location wise, she was closest to the east stairwell. And we know when Nicholas Cruz entered the third floor, he came through the east stairwell. So that first room by the east stairwell was Scott's room, this teacher, Scott Beagle, and then her room. So they heard the fire alarm. She said even before the fire alarm, they heard some popping noises, one long succession of popping noises, and then it stopped. And they're like, what is that? And then they heard another long succession of popping noises. And her thinking was, because it's Valentine's Day and there were balloons, and she's thinking that maybe there's are balloons that are popping, or maybe it's somebody trying to run the computer cart over the grass, or something she didn't know. So that was her assumption. It was probably balloons or something. And then the fire alarm goes off. So she did what they're supposed to do. She grabs her keys, she gets her notebook with all the information of the students in it, and she starts getting them out into the hallway. So when she gets out to the hallway, she has all the students out of her classroom. She closes the door. She locks the door. She says Scott is doing the exact same thing with his kids. Now there's like this big log jam because they're supposed to go down that east stairwell. And she said it's not unusual during a fire drill to have the log jam because you've got kids coming out, not just her and Scott's classes, but all the other classes. Some are going to the west side, some are going to the east side, but there's 10 classrooms up there. So she said the funneling, it's not unusual, but she said all of a sudden she started hearing loud screaming in the stairwell, and the kids started to back up. Now, she actually saw Nicholas Cruz enter the east stairwell while she was still in the stairwell, while Scott was still in the stairwell. She said he was just spraying the bullets back and forth, back and forth. So she quickly rushed all the kids back into her classroom, which Scott was doing the same thing. She gets them in. She gets the door closed. She no sooner gets that door closed and locked that she jumps over to where her kids are in a hard corner. And she said she literally landed in the kids' laps. She said no sooner had she landed in their laps than Nicholas Cruz puts the gun and shoots out the window of her classroom. Now, no one in her classroom was injured. By this time, she had about 20 students. So not all of her students got back into the classroom. They were still out in the hallway. So then she knew she had been injured, that her left arm had been injured. She reached over and she saw some blood on her hand, but she didn't want to let the kids know because she thought that might worry them. And she felt like it was just a graze. It was not a big deal. And it must not have been because they didn't mention it any more than that. So she said it was about 3:45, so a little over an hour before someone finally came to get the kid, clear the kids out of her classroom. So in the meantime, she could hear a young man out in the hallway crying for help. She said he cried out about 3 different times. And she later learned that was the child who's had been shot 5 times, and he actually took the witness stand. He survived. But that's the one that said he was going to give up, that he didn't think anybody was going to come help him. So when the officers came, they got in through the door because the window was busted out. So they came in through the door. They tell everybody, put your hands on your head. Don't look down. Do not look down. So, of course, the teacher was looking down. She saw Scott Beagle's body. She saw 2 of her other students who didn't make it back into the classrooms were deceased. They were out there. She saw several bodies. And at one point you could tell she was going to start crying, and she kind of stopped herself when she was talking about Scott because she saw him lying there. So, and then of course they had her listen to and watch the videotape of the shooting on her floor. I don't know why. I guess so the jury could see where she was and where Scott was, and yeah. Anyway, and I'll reiterate, it's the prosecution's theory of the case that had Scott Peterson run towards the gunshots, he would have been able to prevent what occurred on the 3rd floor. Not the 7 people killed on the 1st floor, but the ones killed and injured on the 3rd floor. Nobody was injured or killed on the 2nd floor. Thank God. So the next person on the stand is Brett Schroy, a detective with the Coral Springs Police Department. Now, he says he does financial crimes. So he's sitting at his desk at the Coral Springs Police Department. He hears dispatch say that there's an active shooter at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas. Now, he's got a child that goes there. And so his first thought was, I got to go get my son. But he said at the same time that this thing came over the dispatch, every detective that was in that office stood up out of their cubicles, stood up in their cubicles and went, what? And they all ran down and they're putting on their vests and they're grabbing their weapons. He says he was pretty new as a detective, so he got one of the older cars that didn't have a gun rack. So all of his stuff was in the back seat or the trunk. He didn't wear his vest at work because he says he has very little interaction with the public unless he's going to interview a witness or something like that. Then he might wear his vest. But he didn't put any of that tactical gear on and grab his rifle until he was actually at the scene. So they all rush to go to the scene. And I thought it was interesting what he said. He says, was it him or someone else? No, he said this. He said, oh, this was our Super Bowl. This is what we trained for. If we're not trained for this is what we trained for. I wanted to get in there. And I feel like each of the officers that they've put on the stand, the prosecution has put on the stand, has had that same mentality. I got to get in there. I'm gonna be the one to confront him. We're all going to be the quarterback. So I'm just saying that. But he said, I wanted to get in there. I wanted to get in there. I wanted to save my son, and I wanted to save anybody else that I could. Now, he had no idea where his son, he said, I don't know my son's schedule. I don't know. He was a sophomore at the time. It turns out he was fine. He was okay. So he's trying, he sees Scott Peterson when he parked way far away, because by the time these detectives get to the scene. The shooter has been gone, long gone, 10 minutes since the last shots fired. So he's trying to find something to do, basically. So the first thing he and his boss do, the sergeant in charge of the detectives, they break everything into teams of detectives and they say start clearing different rooms. In other words, looking for a shooter. So they go to the auditorium, and they had learned by now that the guy was wearing a red ROTC shirt or a burgundy ROTC shirt and black pants. So he goes into the auditorium. He sees the kids that are in there, and they say, no, the shooter's not in here. So he locks them back into the auditorium. But as he's leaving the auditorium, he sees this stairwell. It wasn't a stairwell, but he sees some narrow steps that go up to what was, I don't know, it was like a film room or something. So a theater room of some kind. So he goes up there and he finds a kid hiding up there who meets the description. He's wearing a red ROTC shirt and black pants, and he's hiding. Well, he detains him. He puts him in handcuffs, turns him over to the police. He takes him back out, and they arrest him, or they take him into custody. He's later cleared. It wasn't him. It was some other kid, poor kid, who was just hiding and now is traumatized, I'm sure. So after that, he does some other things, but he ends up going into the building and actually helping with the injured and things. So I'm just trying to see if I missed anything. So there was probably one more witness that I missed from yesterday, and I will make sure I listen to that and catch you guys up tomorrow. Covered a lot for you today. It's Tuesday, and I'm trying to think what I got planned. I don't have any plans. I'm going to be diamond painting. So I'm actually I finished this. I've done the top part. Now I've done the side part, and now I'm kind of working my way around, just kind of turning the painting as I go. So I'm actually into the garden itself. This is all garden. So I'm going to bling the flowers, and I got to finish up the dress, part of the dress right here. I don't know if you guys can see. Let's see. See, this is the bottom part of her dress. So I just have to finish this up. I'm working in the garden there. And I've added a little, I'm adding a little bit more bling to I want the flowers to kind of pop. So, okay. Have a great Tuesday, everybody. Please don't forget, leave me a comment. Let me know you listened. I always love my comments. I like to read them. All right. Bye, everybody. Have a wonderful day. Take care.